Hey, everybody. So today we're going to be getting into Christopher Nolan's adaptation of the 8th century BC Greek poem, The Odyssey by Homer. And I just want to let you know from here on out on Reclaiming the Faith, it's probably going to be about 90% of these video episodes, which will be on YouTube. The audio alone will be still on my podcast feed. But yeah, if you want the video, come to YouTube. Please comment on it, like, subscribe, share it with a friend. We'll try to build this up a little bit. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get into the Odyssey and the historic faith. All right. So if you're not familiar with the Odyssey, it's good to have a bit of an understanding of it before you go in to see the movie. So let me give you a short summation from AI about the Odyssey. So it says the Odyssey is an ancient Greek epic poem that chronicles the 10-year journey of Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, as he struggles to return home after the Trojan War. And while Odysseus faces mythical monsters, divine wrath from Poseidon, and captivity by the nymph Calypso, his wife Penelope and son Telemachus defend their palace against a group of arrogant suitors who vie for Penelope's hand and Odysseus's throne. Upon finally reaching Ithaca, Odysseus reunites with Telemachus, disguises himself to assess the situation, and ultimately slaughters the suitors with divine assistance to reclaim his kingdom and restore peace to his family. So let me give you a few general reflections on Christopher Nolan's Odyssey adaptation. Well, if you've seen any Christopher Nolan films, you know that cinematically they're going to be pretty amazing. And this film is no different. If you're familiar with the Batman series that featured Christian Bale, that's Christopher Nolan. So if you like the way those looked cinematically, you'll love the Odyssey. The pace is extremely fast, and that's good because the movie is almost 3 hours long. So again, it's good to have at least a cursory knowledge of what's happening before you go into the film, because it just hits the ground running. Super fast pace, which is nice. Now, the characters of Nolan's adaptation obviously differ from those of Homer. The character playing Athena is not of the same race as the one that which Homer portrayed Athena as in the Odyssey. And there are other characters as well that are much more reflective of the times that we live in rather than the times that Homer lived in. So you got to take that for what it is. Of course, they're trying to teach a lesson that's a little bit, Nolan is teaching a lesson that's a little bit more reflective of what's going on around the world, like geopolitically around the world today. And of course, he has his particular political slant on that. So as long as you go into the movie understanding that, I think you'll really enjoy it because it's very well done. Now, we need to know the setting, right? The setting is toward the end of the 12th century BC, and it goes all around the shores of the Mediterranean. So this is happening during the time of the Judges, right? So think Joshua through Samuel, but about halfway or maybe a third of the way through that time of the Judges. And so, of course, in the Levant, in the Promised Land area, you have Joshua and the following judges kicking out many of the previous inhabitants of the Promised Land and putting many of them to death. And so there's this great exodus that happens from the Promised Land, actually involving the descendants of the Nephilim, who showed up after the flood. These were the Anakim and those of similar DNA status. And so, yeah, it's very much reflective of that time, which we'll get into as we go along. Now, the movie hinges, according to this Time magazine article, the movie hinges on this idea that by creating the Trojan horse, Odysseus destroys Zeus's law. That's the movie's term for the ancient Greek concept of xenia, the respectful relationship between host and guest, which can be tricky to explain to a modern audience, according to this Time article on July 24th about the movie. Now, the earliest primary source that explains xenia is from Homer in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. And again, these were written around the 8th century BC. So this is a direct quote from the Odyssey, Book 9. Homer writes, "We are at your knees in hopes of a warm welcome or even a guest gift, the sort that hosts give strangers. That's the custom. Respect the gods, my friend. We're suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred. Zeus will avenge their rights." Now, you have Homer here portraying Zeus as like the patron god, little g, god of strangers, foreigners, wanderers, aliens, that kind of a thing. And I don't mean like little green men aliens, but you understand, right? And so as the centuries progressed, around almost at the time of King Herod the Great's death, right around that time, you have, for the first time, this myth about Zeus and Mercury, or from the Roman perspective, Jupiter and Hermes, coming to a city disguised and in disguise. And the majority of that city does not give hospitality to Zeus and Mercury, or Hermes. And so eventually Zeus and Hermes find a couple that is hospitable to them, and they show kindness to Zeus and Hermes. Hermes and Zeus show kindness to them, but the rest of the people of the city basically get destroyed by Zeus in retaliation or vengeance of their lack of hospitality. And this is reflective in Acts chapter 14, when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and the people recognize Paul as Hermes because he's the main speaker, and they attribute the person of Zeus to Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas exclaimed, like, don't do this. We're people just like you. And Paul and Barnabas encouraged the people of Lystra to worship the one true God. Now, this story, though, it's very reminiscent, the one from the turn of the first, or right before, I think it's around like 8 BC that this story is first written down. It's very similar to what goes down in Genesis 19, actually, in the story of Sodom, and how the people of Sodom did not treat the 2 angels who came into Lot's house with much respect, did they? Now, Lot and his family, for the most part, were saved, except for his wife. And then the people of Sodom, of course, were destroyed. And that passage is really cool, additionally, because it says the Lord rained down fire and brimstone from the Lord, which is pretty cool when you get into 2 powers kind of stuff from Michael Heiser. But regardless, so you see, in a sense, this twisting of a familiar story by people who had probably heard this story and then began to attribute it to the god of storms in the Greek mind, which would be Zeus, storm god, since the Lord rained down fire and brimstone from the heavens, you could say. Well, this story most likely uh, began to be told throughout the world, and then it was attributed to Zeus and Hermes, or Jupiter and Mercury. So you see this twisting by Homer. We're going to get into that in a second, but let's look at a little bit of twisting as well from Christopher Nolan, because he says, and this is from a recent interview with the Los Angeles Times, Nolan discussed Zeus's law. Okay, he said it is the golden rule. Zeus's law is the golden rule? That seems weird. The idea that you treat people the way you want to be treated. Partly because a humble person may be a god in disguise, but it also allows the society to function. People need to travel and trade, and everyone is at the mercy of strangers. Its abuse has terrible consequences, and there's a price to be paid for vengeance, and violence is the most straightforward expression of that. So notice how Nolan is attributing Zeus's law to the golden rule. Now, first of all, again, Nolan's actually twisting Homer, because Homer does not talk about Zeus's law or the law of Zeus. He doesn't talk about that in the Iliad or Odyssey. He does refer to Xenia, and he refers to Zeus being the patron god, basically, of strangers and wanderers. But Nolan twists Xenia to be both hospitality to strangers and the golden rule. That's interesting. So let's begin to look at what the early Christians thought of Homer's writings, because they actually wrote about Homer. So let me show you this. This is from Theophilus of Antioch in AD 180 in his work To Autolycus, Book 2, Chapter 8. Now, if you remember, the title, though, of this is The Odyssey and the Historic Faith, the title of this episode. So I want to take a minute and show you this website. This is a website called thehistoricfaith.com. Now, this is a website created by the people surrounding David Berceau, a man who's been on my podcast 4 different times. I've interviewed him 4 different times. He's incredible. He's written several books that are now for free on this website. And all of the courses that he's taught that used to be under a paywall on this website are now totally free. There are other amazing things that I want to show you on this website as well. Please check this out. Now, here's the Ante-Nicene writings, except look at this. It says it's a modern translation of the early Christian writings. And that's so important, because if you have a hard copy of the Ante-Nicene writings, or you maybe go to a website like Bible Study Tools, which has all the Ante-Nicene writings, the words are in King James type English. Okay, it's quite antiquated and sometimes hard to understand, and yet these guys have put it into a modern translation, which is so cool. Okay, and we're going to look at that in just a second. But if you want to start kind of getting into the early Christian writings, I would encourage you to check this section out here. This link to what the early Christians believed. A lot of this is based off of Berceau's early CDs, the teachings that he would do on CDs about the early Christians believed, what the early Christians believed about baptism or the Lord's Supper or salvation or the 2 kingdoms, all this kind of stuff, which were incredible. And I have so many of those CDs. There are probably only a few from the early days that I don't have, but check out this tab. So let's say you want to look at what the early Christians believed about baptism. So these would be the early Christians of the first 300 years. So you'd click on B, okay, and you find baptism, and click on baptism. And it'll give you a brief synopsis first with some biblical passages to back up what the early Christians believed. Then it'll start going into a little bit deeper understanding about baptism. Then some bullet point key takeaways, and then some questions. So, did the early Christians teach that baptism was tied to repentance and forgiveness of sins? Well, here's Justin Martyr in his first apology, and it gives a citation there, talking about baptism. So you could say, let's read this in context. Great, because you don't want to just proof text, right? Let's read this in context. And it takes you, look at this, isn't that incredible? It takes you right to chapter 61 on Christian baptism. And we knew this was from Justin Martyr's first apology. So that's just incredible, isn't it? Now, let's go back again. What I'd like to show you now is how to find Theophilus, all right, what we were just reading about. You remember this? Theophilus of Antioch to Autolycus, book 2, chapter 8. Well, what you're going to do is go to the Ante-Nicene Library. He's in the later 2nd century. Now, there are some later 2nd century in Volume 1. Volume 1 has the early stuff, with the exception of the Didache that's in a separate volume. But Volume 2 has these later 2nd century guys. So click on Volume 2 and check it out. To Autolycus. Okay? So you would click on that. Okay. Now, we wanted to go to book 2. So here's the section. We want to go to book 2, chapter 8. So here's book 1. Now you go from chapter 14 of book 1 to chapter 1 of book 2. Then you go to chapter 8. Okay. Now, what you want to be aware of is that there's still some kinks that they're working out. And so sometimes you'll get these like standalone lines. Just keep on scrolling, okay? And here we go. Here's the quote. So check it out. Theophilus writes this about Homer. He says, without intending to, they admit, speaking of the Greek writers, that they do not know the truth. Instead, they were inspired by demons and made proud by them. And they spoke whatever those demons moved them to say, for the poets, namely Homer and Hesiod, were, as they say, inspired by the muses, but they spoke from a deceptive imagination, and not with a pure spirit, but with a mistaken one. This is clearly shown by the fact that even to this day, people who are possessed are sometimes exorcised in the name of the living and true God. And these same spirits of error confess that they are demons and that they also inspired these writers in former times. But sometimes some of the writers awakened in their soul, and so, to be a witness both to themselves and to all people, they spoke things that agreed with the prophets about the sole rule of God and about the judgment in similar matters. So this is fascinating. All right? What Theophilus is saying is that sometimes people like Homer and Hesiod, they would relay a lot of accurate information about the past, but it would be twisted as if spoken from a demon, like the demon's perspective on a true event. Kind of like, how would the devil retell Genesis chapter 3? Well, he would paint himself as the hero, the one that's truly trying to give real knowledge to Adam and Eve and teach them how to become gods, independent of God, right? Kind of sounds like some errors of many people today, that you could become a god, that kind of a thing. Yeah. Whether we're talking about Freemasonry or maybe Mormonism or something like that, right? A twisting. Talking about real events, but twisting them to provide a deceptive perspective. And that's what Theophilus is saying happened with Homer. And so, yeah, you see it happening with Christopher Nolan as well. He twists Homer, who's twisting true events. Very interesting. All right, well, Let's keep going. Was Zeus real according to the ante-Nicene Christians? Was Zeus real? We think about myth as terms of like fiction. That's not the way we should think about myth in general. To the ancients, it's stories that help us make sense um, of our existence, why we're here, what we're here to do, that kind of stuff, why things happen the way they do. So let's go to Justin Martyr, all right? And so this is going to be in his second apology in chapter 5. So let's do it. Let's go back, okay? Ante-Nicene Library. Justin Martyr is in volume 1. So we click on that. I'm going to scroll down. We got some Clement of Rome. That's the letter to Diognetus. We got Polycarp, Ignatius of Antioch, right? Really good stuff. Epistle of Barnabas. And here we go. We got Justin Martyr. Now we go to the 2nd century. And what chapter was that in? That was in chapter 5. So let's go to that. All right. Chapter 5 of Justin Martyr. Actually, had it all pulled up here. How the angels sinned. All right. So, when God created the world, he gave humans dominion over earthly things and arranged the heavenly elements for the growth of food and the changing seasons. He established this divine law and created these things for humanity, placing angels in charge of caring for people and everything under heaven. However, the angels violated this role, became infatuated with women, and had children who are known as demons. This would be the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. So he's actually affirming what Enoch talked about. We'll talk about that in a second. They then enslaved the human race, partly through magical writings, partly through instilling fear and inducing punishments, and partly by teaching people to offer sacrifices, incense, and libations, which they desired after being overcome by lustful passions. Among humanity, they spread murders, wars, adulteries, excessive deeds, and all forms of wickedness. And as a result, poets and mythologists, unaware that it was the angels and demons born from them responsible for these actions against individuals, cities, and nations, mistakenly attributed them to God himself and to those considered his true descendants, as well as to those he called his brothers, Neptune and Pluto, and their descendants. Whatever names the angels had given themselves and their children, the people used those names for them. So, what you just read from Justin Martyr is the orthodox position of Christianity for its first 400 years. As Genesis 6 states, a group of angelic beings disobediently left their heavenly abode, copulated with human women, and produced offspring that were giants. Both 2 Peter chapter 2 and Jude directly cite this event. Justin then picks up on the tradition of first Enoch, saying that when the progeny of these angels and women died, those hybrid beings became evil spirits, which the Bible calls demons. However, Genesis 6:12 says that all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth, which appears to imply that several of the rebellious angelic beings copulated with non-human creatures as well. Chapter 7 and 86 of 1 Enoch speak to this and lead the reader to imagine a pre-flood world that would have been quite similar to the one depicted by C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, I realize how absurd that may sound to some, but the King James Bible actually affirms the existence of satyrs or satyrs. You can read that in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 21, and chapter 34, verse 14, which are a chimeric creature that resembles a goat man, like Pan. Now, if those beings were real, when they died, their spirits roamed the earth, which would explain why the Lord commanded the Israelites not to make sacrifices to Pan-like goat demons in Leviticus 17:7. Now, one thing I really want to give Christopher Nolan a lot of credit for is that he presents uh, the world of the 12th century BC as being very similar to that which the Bible describes. You still have giants roaming the land, horrible monster type things like you saw the Cyclops in the Odyssey. And you see like an island full of a race of giants similar to like Goliath and his four brothers, those descendants from in the area of Gath, right? The Philistines and the seafaring people. So it's that was very encouraging to me, and it provided some really good teaching moments with me, with my daughter, to explain to her how I know this seems like mythological, but it was actually probably pretty similar to this in some respects. Just don't let Homer's view be your view because it's twisted. For instance, who was Zeus actually? Who was Zeus actually? Well, you remember in a mythological type view, Zeus is the god of storms, the storm god, kind of like Baal to the Canaanite kind of area, right? Asher, these kind of beings. Enlil. Who was Zeus actually? Well, in Revelation chapter 2, verse 12, the Lord Jesus is speaking, and he says, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the one who has the sharp two-edged sword says this, I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is, and that you hold fast my name and did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one who was killed among you, where Satan dwells." Now notice, this is to the church that's residing in Pergamum. Jesus says that the church that's residing in Pergamum dwells where Satan's throne is. Now, if you go to websites like worldhistory.org, you look up the altar of Zeus in Pergamum, that's it right there, guys. And do you know where this is? This is a reconstructed, the reconstructed altar of Zeus from Pergamum and in the Museum of Berlin. Why is the altar of Pergamum, the altar of Zeus in Pergamum at Berlin? Well, it's because Hitler had it taken there during World War II. Why in the world would Hitler want that? Well, maybe because the altar of Zeus, according to historians, is also what is known as the seat of Satan. Seat of Satan. This is Satan's temple. So, according to the early Christians, Zeus is synonymous with the devil. And that makes the ending scene very interesting. So the ending scene of Christopher Nolan's Odyssey is different than the actual poem. But it achieves a similar purpose, but it's different. I'm going to read to you a little bit of the dialogue from that ending scene. This is not the very last bit of dialogue, but it's almost the last bit of dialogue where Odysseus is talking to his wife Penelope about why the world is about to burn, basically. And he says, "Yes, my queen, the breaking of Zeus's law spread like plague. Our age of bronze is collapsing, and maybe he couldn't bear to see the ruins of what he'd done anywhere, least of all his home. To burn the walls of Troy was to burn the entire world, or the world entire. So, what is Nolan encouraging the viewer to do? Nolan is encouraging the viewer to keep what he describes as Zeus's law. So there's got some, for one, there's a little bit of political stuff going on right there, right? If you're thinking of that as hospitality to foreigners, okay? But it's also got some extreme religious implications there, because if you remember, Nolan has been equating the golden rule with Zeus's law, suggesting that Zeus was teaching this before Jesus. That, or equating Zeus with Jesus, as some people who don't understand etymology, right, have tried to suggest that the name Jesus came from Zeus, which is absolutely dumb and has no basis in fact. But think about that. If Zeus is Satan, then Nolan is saying, if you don't want the world to burn, you better obey Satan. That's incredibly horrific. Something that I was explaining to my daughter there in the movie, you could kind of see it coming, because Nolan refers to Zeus's law, or the law of Zeus, over and over and over, even though Homer doesn't do that. It's just a theme that is beat into your head like a drum from Nolan. You better not break Zeus's law. Wow, that is so dangerous. So I really want to encourage you to check out the early Christian writings. Particularly, go to this website, thehistoricfaith.com. See what they had to say about these things and compare it to how you're viewing the world. I would really love for you guys to pray for me. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be interviewing David Berceau for the 5th time. And we're going to be talking about this website here and some other stuff as well. Very important stuff as well about this, about the early Christians. So yeah, that should be coming in 2 weeks. Again, probably from here on out, 90% of the content of Reclaiming the Faith will be video driven. It'll go right to my YouTube channel, while 10% will be just audio alone. And that 10% will probably just be the Bible study I do with my wife on 1 Corinthians. And if I post sermons that I preached at my home church, I'll probably just put the audio on there as well. But for the majority, as a general rule, it's going to be video driven, okay? And so I really want to encourage y'all to go to my YouTube channel. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you've liked this video, please hit that like button, comment on it, and I'll try to dialogue with you there. And if you have some suggestions of things you want me to cover from an early Christian perspective, put that in the show notes as well, or in the comment section of YouTube as well. Get it to your friends. Tell them about what we're doing here. And please continue to be in prayer for me and my family, for my church. Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And I hope this is a blessing to you. All right. God bless you guys.